He evaded us at the 2 screenings of that other movie he's written, but alas, we have cornered and captured Peter Morgan from his wild habitat on that island off of Europe and finally got him into our podcast. Howdy. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, Senior Editor for Creative Screenwriting Magazine, and yes, while we were unable to get Peter Morgan for our last King of Scotland podcast, which would have been great since he co-wrote that film, he was recently in town from the UK, and we were lucky enough to be able to do a podcast and a screening of his film, The Queen, which Peter wrote on his own and was directed by the always sharp Stephen Frears. Terrifyingly, when we got to the theater, we learned that there was only one microphone, which made the Q&A very interesting, and that microphone didn't even work at first until our sound guru, Gary Watson, who records the podcast, also learned that he couldn't tap into the mic's feed in order to get the sound that we're usually quite happy with. Alas, our backup device was used for room sound from the speakers in the theater, and I've done the best I can to mix it. I think the sound came out okay. But really, you got to remember, it's the content that matters. It's the content. And I tell you, Peter Morgan, aside from being a really smart writer, is a pretty darn good interview too. So I apologize again for sound glitches, but I'm still really happy with this Q&A, and I hope you will be too. Speaking of things to be happy about, you can now take 10% off any of our 50 Expo DVDs that we have for sale right now. You could check them out at www.expodvds.com. There's an array of interviews and classes ranging from William Goldman to Joss Whedon, Tim Minear, and teachers like Michael Haig. Just type in the discount coupon code DVD Podcast, and it will take 10% off any of the items in your order. But remember, that coupon is only good if used before January 1st, 2007. Of course, thanks again for all your letters. Been getting some really good ones lately, and as I just conducted 4 screenings in 1 week, which will end up becoming some good upcoming podcasts, I must admit again to being slow in responding. But fear not, I will be writing back to everyone who writes in, and you could always feel free to drop me a line at rsvp@creativescreenwriting.com. But now, without further ado, let's jump right into the Q&A after I introduce screenwriter Peter Morgan to discuss writing his latest film, The Queen.
Bear with us, we have one microphone, but we're going to make it work. I know we're going to make it work. We'll start where we always do, breaking in stories. People always want to know how folks got their start in the industry. And your start, the first produced credit that I know of, is a TV show called Shalom Joan Collins. Awesome title. Could you talk about how you broke in, got an agent, and started in television?
It's not true. The first credit the first involvement in a film that I had was on a film called Madame Suzatska. I did 6 months rewrites on that film. It was written by Ruth Pravajabwala, and that wasn't a joke. That's her name. And the director was John Schlesinger, and she was, I think a 2-time Oscar winner. She wrote Room with a View and so forth, and she worked a lot with Merchant Library. And she and Schlesinger obviously didn't get on, and so he needed, somebody to come in. That was my first, film assignment. The way I got into it, I was at university, and I wrote for the theatre at university. And one of the plays was spotted by a producer of training films, and he asked me if I would write. They were effectively sort of behavioural sales training videos, and it was for John Cleese's company. And so I was writing these scripts for him to shout in fury at people, and people would then say, that's obviously not the way we want you to behave, and then he would behave as a model salesman, and people would say, that's the way we want you to behave. And the films were quite cretinous, but it was a good experience. It's a good way to start writing.
And that led you to the BBC?
Eventually that actually led me to an agent. The agent led me to Madame Suzatska. Madame Suzatska led me to the BBC and Shalom Joan Collins and things like that. Shalom Joan, I can't believe I'm talking about Shalom Joan Collins. Shalom Joan Collins is a story about a mother and a daughter of 45 who still hasn't left home, with a very controlling, rather punishing mother. It's a Jewish household, And on one day she, and this happens prior to the film starting, the play starting, and she has been driving out and she's been flagged down by a limousine. And the limousine driver tells her that inside, that the car is broken down, it's Joan Collins inside, and she needs desperately to get to an airport to catch a plane, and would this woman mind taking her? And this woman takes her, and then at the airport, Joan Collins says, "How can I possibly thank you?" And this woman stammers, saying, "Come for tea." And so this is the story of her coming back and telling her mother this, and her mother then taking over the entire occasion and inviting her own friends, and the two of them resolving. I mean, in other words, it's about the preparations for Joan Collins to come for tea. It's really not a major movie, but it was. I hope it was funny, and it bears an uncanny resemblance to my own family.
Shalom, Peter Morgan. Right on. Sounds great. To my knowledge, the seeds for this project actually started with your partnership with Stephen Frears in the 2003 BBC television show The Deal, about Tony Blair's rise to power. Talk about how your paths crossed with Stephen Frears. I think he's an amazing director. Loved his job here, and how after The Deal, you guys got the idea for this sequel of sorts called The Queen.
That's exactly right. I had written a script about the relationship between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who will shortly be the British Prime Minister, and when Tony Blair finally steps down, and it's a very intense rivalry, and it's like a sort of Cain and Abel story. They're best friends, but they've stabbed one another in the back so many times. Anyway, and so it's a story of political rivalry. To be honest, I have no idea quite how the script got to Stephen. We didn't send it to him, but somebody must have read it and thought this would be perfect for him. And then the next thing we knew, we got a phone call from his agent, and of course we were thrilled. He just made Dirty Pretty Things, and when you put it in that context, it makes perfect sense. Dirty Pretty Things have been a story about society's outsiders. It made, therefore, to me, perfect sense that he would then want to make a film about the ultimate society's insiders, people controlling the establishment. And we just got on terribly, terribly well, and it seemed to be a very good fit. And the film, it's certainly, if not the favourite, then certainly one of the top 2 or 3 things, in things that I've done so far as a personal favourite. And it won some prizes, and so people naturally wanted us to repeat it in some shape or form. So this actually, The Queen, although it's the first of the 2 that was released theatrically, it is actually technically a sequel. And because it's made in exactly the same style. I mean, if you'd seen The Deal, it's exactly like that. And so people asked us to come up with, was there anything else we wanted to explore? And somebody, I forget who, it must be one of the producers, mentioned Diana's death as a sort of iconic British event, which would offer an opportunity to look at the country, and it was felt, hopefully, that Stephen and I, if we tackled Diana's death, that it wouldn't be a sort of, just a sort of a sleazy conspiracy theory drama, or whatever. All sounds rather good, but I checked it out on the internet, and it's really a very short hop from typing in Diana death. You get to sort of UFOs very quickly, and having done that, I sort of I think I must have spent about 24 hours looking at Diana's death before just getting into a coma of boredom. And the days following her death, I thought were incredibly interesting. And that seemed to me to be a 5-day period in which one could really, in which Britain revealed itself, and it offered an opportunity to say quite a lot about the world in which we live nowadays.
You've really shown a knack for research and taking true life events and fictionalizing them in a really dramatic, interesting way. Obviously, you co-wrote Last King of Scotland with Jeremy Brock. We had him and Kevin MacDonald in the screening series earlier this year. You weren't in town. You were invited though. But you've done it again here, and it's hard to do that kind of research. And obviously, the royal family is very private. Could you talk about how you were able to put together the events, obviously the thing that is transparent that everyone can see, and then do the kind of insider research? Because I've read that you've spoken to a lot of people that have worked at the palace, people in Blair's government, and able to fictionalize it and keep it entertaining, which I think you did.
Well, I think, what I did was I wrote it as I wanted it to be first, That is to say, I didn't start with research. I started with imagination and started with, deliberately cherry-picking incidents which I knew could never be substantiated or cross-checked. So in other words, the private audience, it's the only area of both their professional lives that is unminuted. So that, as a writer, is immediately exciting to me. And so I had very early on, it was sort of almost immediate, I had this idea for a structure which was a big audience scene at the beginning, where you establish a relationship between them in which she effectively just pisses on him. And then a sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday structure with another big audience scene at the end in which the tables are turned within their relationship. That came to me very quickly, and I wrote a draft of what I imagined would happen very, very quickly. I think I wrote a draft of that, in just 2 or 3 weeks. And that, I think, probably comprises about 70% of what the film is. But the subsequent 30% took me about 9 months. And that was because having put down the architecture of what I wanted the story to be, I then went out and did all the research, and the research made me change bits, and of course you learn new things, in which case you rewrite whole sections, and but essentially that structure remained solid, and I've always protected that idea of sort of, for me, research can be really misleading. I don't mean truth is misleading. What I mean is you can get interested in things and sort of go down wrong avenues because they're just naturally so gripping. So for me, it's always important to write what I want it to be, and to write how I imagine it is, and to create, as it were, a film structure, and then to use the research to, but to keep, as it were, the tentpoles in place.
Were people reluctant to talk to you? Was it difficult to get that kind of access, or because of the success of the deal, did you at least have a start with Blair's office and move forward?
Yeah, you're very perceptive. That's exactly right. The deal was a sort of course they're jokes, but essentially it's the first time that our politicians have not been treated in caricature. Satire is the normal language of analysis of politics, culturally, and and impressions and mockery, frankly, and abuse. So the idea that one could be treating Tony Blair, particularly remarkable now, but the idea that one could treat him as a sort of a rounded human being in any shape or form, and to pitch a drama in which, oh my God, you forget you're watching, oh my God, it's Tony Blair I'm watching, because I'm actually rooting for something, in other words. So I think people, for that reason, were more ready to talk to us. And then exactly the same pattern followed, which is that they're very closed at the beginning, almost hostile. And then, as they hopefully begin to detect that, they can just sense if you're after something scurrilous. And if they sense that you're not after something scurrilous, and that actually you do want to balance arguments in hopefully in an adult way, they soon become they just can't stop. They just go on and on and on, and often it was very difficult for us to leave. We had to shut people up because they're so pent up with it, and it is also it's quite it's really interesting when these people talk often. The thing that surprised me about the research was how vile the courtiers were in the. They were much worse than the politicians. The politicians were really, straightforward and surprising that the palaces. There were 3 palaces. There's Buckingham Palace, which looks after the Queen, as it were, which is the Queen's court. Then there's Kensington Palace, which is Diana's court, and St James's Palace, which is Charles's. And each of these courts have their own press, their own PR, their own staff. And they're all absolutely vicious about one another, and so actually we spent a lot of time detoxing, from what was clearly spin, quite vicious spin, and often you would just have to try and navigate a line through lies. There was a lot of invective, a lot of agendas.
Tell me briefly about your writing habit. How many hours a day do you write? What do you do to battle writer's block? And also your relationship as a working writer with Stephen Frears. I've interviewed other writers that have worked with him, and many times they've said that he isn't that specific sometimes on notes. He just rips out a page or crosses off a page and says, make it better. So your work habits, writer's block, and working with Stephen Frears.
Well, I write very early in the morning. I get up early, and that's... I get up early. Hello. I get up early, and I've said that 12 times now, so... and then I normally around lunchtime, I stop writing. And then in the afternoon, I'll take, time off or do things, interact with human beings, or I don't know what, do some sport, I don't know, exercise, I don't know. And then in the evening, generally speaking, I have to deal with phone calls from this side of the world. It's very, very difficult for that reason. Yeah, it's very difficult because it makes, it's really unpleasant actually. Well, not the individual phone calls, but the fact that at that time of the evening you then start getting your head churned up again. It's unhelpful for me to get phone calls, up until 9. I mean, at 9 o'clock's my cut-off. I just turn, I never answer the phone after 9 o'clock. But even in between 6 and 9, it's tough, because it interferes with everything, and you want to wind down at that point. What was the other question? Writer's block. Well, I mean, touch wood. I mean, what is writer's block? I mean, I know what you mean, but writer's block is presumably when you've got lots of ideas, but none of them seem good enough, or they don't seem quite right, and that's just sort of taste paralysis. I get that a lot, where I walk around and I think, would that be any good? And I try that for a bit, because I infinitely prefer writing original screenplays. I mean, I find, they just get. It's not. I mean, I love The Lost King of Scotland, and I really loved working. But watching an original is a very different experience afterwards. It's you just as a writer, I feel I connect with it so much more. It's a much more intimate, and because you just know where it all came from. It's an adaptation, no matter how radical the adaptation, never feels quite like. It feels like, I don't know, it feels like you're looking after someone else's kid rather than your own child. So, with originals, I guess what you mean, writer's block is where I'm playing with ideas, none of which quite work. The idea, I haven't yet had that period where I sort of don't feel like writing. I feel pretty compelled to write. That may be because I have an addictive nature, I have no idea. But I feel compelled to write, and I think if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would still write every bit as much as I do. I mean, I feel it's something I just have to do, and I don't know why. Oh, Stephen, yeah, well, he, you're right, actually, it's quite an accurate representation of what he's like. You just sort of, there are a couple of lines in there that are his, one or two. The bit about the bit about her being a mechanic, that was, he found that, and so I put that in. And he just, as he sinks himself into the material, he takes you on the journey with him. So, I mean, and that goes for every single part of the film. It's rather like going on a sort of, I joke with him, I call it sort of like a salon, because he takes everyone with him on the journey. So if you go on a scout for a location, you see all sorts of people on that should simply not be on a location scout, composers and also, and he just takes everyone along. And, for example, the fact that the Jeep does that in the river was because I was on the location, because we were actually being infested by midges in Scotland. I don't know if you've been to Scotland, but in the late summer, these billions of midges come, and in the script, the Land Rover gets stuck in a wood, and it was just unbearable because of the midges. And I went off and I found this river, and I said, "Can't we do it in the river? There are no midges." And so we shot the whole thing in the river. And I don't know. When I said, "Why am I here?" he says, "Well, you asked me to do it. My view is I'm doing it. You might as well come along." And he does. He sends little text messages, go, "I think you can do better." And you go, "Well, in which way?" And he goes, "I don't know. Go away, do better." So it's quite like that, which is quite infuriating, but adorable too. We're doing another film together now. Well, not yet. I've got to fucking write it.
Were there any specific points of contention between the two of you before we move on? Or could you talk about anything that was a disagreement and how you guys resolved it?
Not through taste. Sorry, the disagreement was that I wanted to go away on a holiday for 4 days and he wouldn't let me. And I remember sitting in my car, and only a writer would understand this, I think. I sat there, I was so angry with him because he wouldn't let me, because I had forfeited my holiday and I'd done some work and I hadn't got a thank you. This is all quite Queenie, I understand, but right, yes. And so I sat there with my cell phone and was composing a text message to him, and I spent 20 minutes thinking, how hurtful can I make this? And I composed and rewrote this text message so many times. It's one of the most polished pieces of writing I've ever done. And it had many drafts, and it was really hateful. He then took this phone around his entire community of writers. I gather that David, I was thrilled with the audience. He went to David Hare, Hanif Kureishi. They were all shown this message. They all went, ha, ha, ha. On taste, he wanted more Charles in than I. That was the only real... he wanted both more Charles and more Diana than I did. The only real squabble we had was I kept asking him to take footage of Diana out. I wanted less, and I won't say that I entirely got my way, because there's still one montage of Diana in there that I wish wasn't. With Charles, he made me write more Charles. He got hooked to how political it was, how all of them were trying to undo one another, and he loved the bitchiness of that, and he loved the agendas. And so that really improved it. When he asked me, for example, one or two of those scenes with the Prime Minister with his aides, where they're talking about, Charles distancing himself and, putting in and all that kind of stuff, that was due to Stephen Sent. He said, go away and make that more complicated. I think it's more interesting. And so I went and had more meetings and did more research. There were scenes, though, of Charles in the aeroplane coming back from Paris on the phone to Camilla, because he talked to her from the cockpit, and although I thought they were very moving, the scenes, I'm pleased that we in the end took them out, because it just was sort of distracting. It involved introducing a character that I didn't think belonged in it.
It's very hard to kind of put a human face in these characters. You did a great job. One of the most interesting things you did was how the Queen actually shows her emotion through the connection with the stag. A stag of 14 points, way past its time. Kind of like her, she felt at home with it. It was an imperial stag, nonetheless. Talk about that setup. Is it based on fact at all, or an invention? Also, use of the word stalking. It was just impossible not to notice that they were talking about going out and stalking the stag, and it was stalking journalists that essentially led to Diana's death. So I thought it was very interesting on many levels, and I just would love to hear how it fit into your mind.
I mean, you're right, and there's telephoto lenses and guns, and hunting. Diana being also the goddess of hunting. It's hunting as a theme. It's all the way through it. The truth is that the royal family didn't go deer stalking. In the immediate aftermath of Diana's death, they went grouse shooting. I was thinking about how to do it, and I was in one part of this. During the writing process, I was in Austria in the mountains, and in this little cabin, and I went out for a walk one afternoon, and completely on my own on this mountain, and I turned a corner, and as far away as the people in the front row was this stag, and it's an incredibly powerful moment. The stag is absolutely vast, and the stag and I had a little moment, and that was that, and then the stag ran into the trees. A couple of days later, I was in the local, you can only call it an inn, it really isn't a restaurant, it's like an inn, and the chef there was the only person, there are 4 or 5 houses in this village, no more. He's the only person that had a gun. And some people came in and said their Land Rover had hit a stag, and it had fallen into the brook and needed finishing off. And would he do it? So he ran out and did that. And then the next day I was just walking past the inn again, and somebody said to me, "Do you want to see the stag?" And so they took me into, there's an aristocratic family locally, and they have a refrigeration room, very like the one in the film. And they took me in to have a look at the stag, and the stag was hanging there. And it sort of, it made it just is an unbelievably arresting image. And at the time I just happened to be writing this, and so I changed the whole subplot around that. And you're quite right. A 14-point stag is a stag that has evaded capture, and so and has possibly survived rather longer than it would be expected to, and that's what makes it such a rarity, such a trophy. And I did feel, I've had some amazing responses. Just amazing responses to the stag. One that always strikes me is that a woman said to me, "Was the stag Diana?" And I said, "Why?" I didn't say no or yes, it doesn't really matter what I think. And she said, because, in the script, or in the film it said, the stag had wandered over onto a neighbouring estate, and she was English, but she drifted into France, which is where she died, and that was the neighbouring estate. I thought, blimey, this is very good deal more, imaginative than I'd come up with. But for me, it was the Queen coming to terms and confronting, in some way, a metaphor for something that is outdated and probably should have been culled a long time ago, but has somehow survived beyond expectation.
We're going to open it up to the crowd in just a few minutes, a few last questions. Just really interesting with your exposition and some of the cuts, most notably when they learn of the death. Robin walks in to advise the Queen, and then it cuts straight to Charles's office. You do that again, something with Blair advising them. It was another cut like that in which the exposition starts and then it cuts to another scene. Talk about, I'll just go back to the first one, when they're told about the death. Was that in your script to cut like that, or was that something that came from the editing room? Because it was just really lean and mean, great exposition.
It was. I'm assuming the second one you mean was Tony Blair when he said, "Ma'am, I would advise you to do the following." Then you cut to her. Then you cut actually to my favourite line in the film, which is the Queen walking up to the door, knocking, going, "Mummy!" That's why, I don't know why, that's my favourite line.
So talk about splitting those scenes up and starting a thought and then completing it in a different scene, because that was basically my question, because I thought it was just fascinating.
Well, with Charles, actually there are two different things. With Charles, that it wasn't because I wanted to spare an audience watching, Tony Blair. I thought it would be. Let me answer it by going about the Queen first. The Queen talking to her mother. The scene seemed to me to be between the Queen and her mother. That seemed to be a more interesting scene than between the Prime Minister and the Queen. I thought the Queen would be able to show more emotion. There'd be more. She'd be able to talk more freely in that scene and show her emotions more freely. So I made the judgment that it would be better that way. Blair had already done what I wanted him to do in that scene. He'd already given her a bollocking, and that was the assertion of his authority over her. With the other one, I wanted to show Charles. And forgive me for this, but I do know people that know Charles, and they talked through what had happened that night, and that he had been very distraught, and I wanted to just show it, and the only I don't know why there's a sort of muffled cry was in the script, I think, and the only word I had him say was no, 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 I think, and he wasn't more articulate than that. And it's sort of quite odd watching, the Prince of Wales do that. It's not a scene you expect to see.
Last question before we turn to the crowd, because that was a great cut. I had to ask that question. So what does the royal family think of this, if you've heard any reactions to this kind of private time? And also, what is your opinion on the royal family? You argue both sides in the film about, they cost the country $30 to $40 million a year. Some people still want to get rid of them, the 40,000 acres they have, etc. So any reactions they've had that you've heard of, and from the Queen herself, etc., and your thoughts on the royal family?
No reaction from the Queen. We have been invited to lunch by her private secretary, which I could walk around with a basket going, "Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am." He's asked us for lunch, and apparently he's furious that the chap playing him is about 30 pounds heavier than he is. It is also assumed that if he asks us for lunch, that the boss will probably pop in for coffee, but we haven't at this stage, and this may sound stupid and coy, but we're not sure whether to accept or not. It just doesn't. I'm not sure that it feels right to accept on either side, to have a relationship with either side. I've declined the opportunity to meet Tony Blair, even though it'd be hilarious, but I mean, it would. I just don't think it's appropriate. I think if possible, I'm hoping probably to write about him again, and I don't want to have a relationship with him of any description. What was the other one? Oh, the royal family. Well, it makes no sense. I mean, it is a complete nonsense having them, and we're in 2006, and I mean, there's something odd about the film, which is that I'm pretty critical. I mean, people say it's a very affectionate portrait, and I suppose to some degree it is because I have compassion for her, but they are out of touch and batty and removed, and I don't think it makes any sense whatsoever living in a society in which privilege is handed on through an accident of birth. Not anymore. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. It feels profoundly unjust, and it would make much more sense, I think, to have an elected president, as a head of state. Having said that, I think she's in an absolutely untouchable position right now, and know that all anti-monarchist, what we call in England Republican debate, has been suspended and will be suspended until she passes. She seems to me in the last couple of years to have moved into a completely untouchable bracket now. Much like Queen Elizabeth I or Victoria. She's having. And it's hard to find fault. That's why this week was so interesting. This is one of the few weeks where the British people really reflected for the first time. Oh my God, we've got a monarchy. Oh my God, they're mad. What the hell are we doing? And then no sooner did the week pass and she came down than very apathetically we all got on with our lives again, thinking, oh well, there they are. It's really mad. They're harmless. In a funny way, I think we're the villains of the piece because we don't know what to make of them. We sort of torture them, and I think we should either treat them sensibly or get rid of them.
I'm all for democracy, but presidents can be tricky too, man. Trust me. Trust me. All right, let's get some questions from the crowd. Right here in the front row. Question was regarding using archival footage and how you write or didn't write around it.
I did my best. I mean, for example, in the case of where she was watching herself on the television in her bedroom, in that particular instance, I actually wrote those lines because I wanted those specific lines from Diana. I wanted Diana to be talking about whether she might or might not become queen, and I wanted the queen to be watching Diana, saying, yes. When Tony Blair is with his wife and they're discussing all that in that room, and there's the monarchies being debated, I invented a talk show because I didn't know what bits they'd come, and I indicated that it should be Republican, as it were, anti-monarchist debate. But there's a brilliant guy, a documentary maker called Adam Curtis, who worked on this project with us, and he just has access to some extraordinary footage, and he cut together the stuff, and it was much better than my imagination.
Cool. Time for a couple more questions. Sorry, right there in the middle. Great. The question was, did you write any scenes regarding the sons? Because they had no dialogue. They were just shown from far away. Was that something that was cut out because they're the part of the family that was kind of missing?
I deliberately didn't write them. If I'd have had my way, actually, I would have kept the whole drama to the Queen and Blair, but I realised obviously needed some of the other people. But I didn't. I wrote them. I mean, clearly you needed them in that scene where the news was broken to them. But even then, it was written in the script that you only see the backs of their heads. In fact, it was written that you see them through the crack in the door as Charles, as it were, talks to them. But they just lost their mum, and it didn't feel remotely relevant to us.
Another question, right here, you sir. Two questions. One is, are you going to write about Blair, Bush, and Iraq? And also, you'd heard that your play, Frost Nixon, had been bought. Why'd you write it as a play first rather than a film? And is it going to become a film? Obviously, anything you say about either of those?
As it were, for the third part of the Blair Godfather trilogy, The Descent into Madness. Both The Deal and The Queen, I waited 10 years. In fact, what I meant was I was writing about something that happened 10 years earlier, and I think I would need to wait still a few more years, and Michael Sheen would need to get a little bit older. So I don't know yet. I mean, I think in 5 or 6 or 7 years, more will be revealed about the whole Iraq adventure, and it may not be that, I mean, right now, if you were to put a gun to my head and say you have to write it now, I'd write about 2000. I'd write about the Clinton-Bush handover and how Blair stretched to go in between these two, to as it were, maintain such a strong allegiance to both when it would seem that you'd have to choose and you'd have to commit, and also somehow to take in that election of 2000. But the British political response to America is one that would be fascinating to write. The first time a British Prime Minister goes to America and sees Air Force One, the White House. I mean, things are very shabby in the UK. He flies on British Airways, and his the flat looks like that. I mean, there are no dimmer switches or guards. So it's not like the West Wing. It's very shabby. So it is very, it's very imposing. When with Frost Nixon, I wanted to write it as a play because I don't know. It just felt to me like I was particularly pissed off with movies at the time, and it felt to me like the theatre was a far less complicated, much simpler medium to deal with. Having now met and dealt with people who work in the theatre, I have a renewed faith in movie people. You've never met such a bunch of oh dear. And yes, I have sold the rights, and I'm currently working on it with Ron Howard. We spent yesterday in Orange County looking at San Clemente, Richard Nixon's house on the beach there in Casa. It's called Casa Pacifica, and we went to the Nixon Library, which was certainly an eye-opening experience for me, and his birthplace, and it was a very interesting day.
Right here, you named the front row. Did you always have Helen Mirren in mind for the role of the Queen, and was she at all resistant to taking it?
Yeah, no, she came with the package, as it were. She, the producer of The Deal and of this is also the producer of Prime Suspect, and he had lunch with her, and he came running back and saying that in a certain light he felt she looked quite like the Queen. And I thought she didn't at all. I didn't know what he was talking about. And in fact, for the first couple of days of filming, I don't think she looked like the Queen. And in fact, on the very first day of filming, I was standing by this statue, and Helen walked in, and while I was talking, because I was leaning against the statue like this, it was actually the first shot was when she comes down the staircase, and he said that the stag has died, has been shot, and she goes, he goes on the neighbouring estate, and she goes, "What estate?" in close up. I don't know if you remember the shot, but that was the first shot we did, and I was at the bottom of that stairs, and leaning against the statue, and Helen was there, and she came over and joking, and she moved my hand, and I suddenly realised she'd moved my hand onto the tits of the statue, and there was a sort of an electrician or something walking around, and she was like, he's a bit of all right," and she wasn't there yet. You know what I mean? She wasn't. Whereas 4 or 5 days later, she had just gone somewhere completely different. And for the rest of the film, the way she walked, the way she held herself, she would walk on set, people would start sort of talking nervously and giggling and sort of going, "Good morning, ma'am." And she had an extraordinary effect on people. It was like being on set with the Queen. And when she was there, you would just sort of straighten that, automatically. It was very odd. And she, I think, the really great actors, they go there so much that they really start to take on, their physiognomy starts to change. And I thought by the end of the shoot she looked far more like it. I think I'm probably not making sense, but she really, everything about her had gone there. And so he was right, the producer, I was wrong.
Time for a few more questions. Right here, you, sir. Do you consider yourself to be a political writer because your last couple works have had an emphasis on politics and history?
I mean, no, I don't actually. I think, I write these. I call them in my head these sort of odd little love stories, and I think that this is a strange little love story. I thought that The Deal was a strange love story. I think The Last King of Scotland was a strange love story. I guess historical figures and politicians really interest me, but I don't think of myself as a political writer. I absolutely think that what I do is I write rivalries or love stories or friendship stories. Stories about connections between awkward people, unlikable people, people who find it difficult to connect with other human beings, difficult to be liked. Richard Nixon, the Queen, Idi Amin. They're not automatically a warm, likable bunch. But I find something that I really like in all of them.
Interestingly, there isn't really a specific antagonist in this movie. Did that present a problem for you? It was more about class struggle, old versus new, inner family battle. How did you deal with that? Because it is a strange thing to write, because the antagonist wasn't crystal clear.
No, but there was conflict, and and a dialectic. There were two value systems in conflict, and that is drama in itself. You don't need a baddie. You just need two points of view which disagree, and then you automatically have drama. I think there is a baddie in there. To be honest, I thought we were the baddies that week. I don't think that people standing on streets holding candles like that, they were lunatics. And there was a lot written about Diana in the days after Diana's death. There's a very interesting book called After Diana, which is a collection of essays written by very considerable and formidable thinkers, journalists, philosophers. And they're just mad. And they're all howlingly embarrassed for what they've written and about what they've written. A couple of years on, what we made of Diana, what we held her up to be or hoped that she would be, what our hopes for her were, it seemed completely ludicrous. And I think our anger and people, you saw them there tearing their hair out and crying and yet going home and then being completely cold to their own husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, and going out in the public, behaving like, and you'll understand what I mean, it's not a disparaging remark, but behaving like Italians. For the English to do that is bizarre. And I don't know if it was rolling news or what it was, but I thought we behaved like idiots, I think.
I guess last question, pretty serious one. Is there any truth to the rumor of you writing, not the sequel you talked about earlier in the Tony Blair trilogy, but a different one called The Queen 2: The Vengeance, where the Queen gets in her Land Rover, goes around and stalks down and runs over journalists? No? Okay. All right, well, hey, you've been very generous with your time. Give it up again for Peter Morgan.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Thanks again to screenwriter Peter Morgan for coming down for the Q&A. And of course, remember, we generally post on Fridays, so make sure if you've clicked that subscribe button in iTunes or your podcasting software that you hit refresh on Fridays. And be forewarned that, again, later in December, I believe there's going to be a week or two in which we will be posting 2 podcasts during the course of 1 week. Fridays and Tuesdays would be my guess, but it will be announced so that even if you somehow miss an episode, you can still go back and download it. We're doing this to make sure that all of our Academy and WGA voters on both coasts and around the world are able to hear these podcasts before the year's end for their consideration, quote unquote. But hey, it's fun for everyone. I'm not sure which episode we have for you next week. You'll have to tune in to find out. And thanks again to everyone who's been tossing in tips to our PayPal virtual tip jar. If you dig this podcast or a certain episode, please feel free to toss in a tip by going to www.creativescreenwritingmagazine.blogspot.com and look for the PayPal icon on the top right. This helps with equipment, tapes, drives, bandwidth, and of course, fine wine. I said beer last week. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, senior editor for Creative Screenwriting Magazine, thanking you again for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.